Daniel had never been good at sleeping after his shifts. The sterile white lights of the hospital seemed to cling to him long after he left, making his mind race even when his body begged for rest. Tonight was no different. The clock on his phone read just past 6 p.m. The sky has shifted from blue to orange and red as the sun sets. He tugged at the strap of his worn backpack and decided to take his usual shortcut through Riverside Park. The park was quiet, which seems odd at this time of the evening. The grass was warm and dry, the trees whispering in the gentle evening breeze. Daniel liked it this way. No chatter, no questions, no stares. Just him and the silence. For as long as he could remember, he had felt like an outsider. His adoptive mother, a kind but guarded woman, raised him with love, but also with secrets. He had always known he was adopted. There was no hiding that, but every attempt to ask about his origins had been met with the same response. Some things are better left in the past, Daniel. He had learned to stop asking. Still, sometimes he wondered what pieces of himself had been left behind with the truth. He was pulled out of his thoughts by movement up ahead. On a park bench not far from the path, a woman staggered, gripping the edge of the wooden seat as though the earth tilted beneath her feet. Daniel's training kicked in immediately. He quickened his pace, his eyes narrowing in concern. "Ma'am," he called out, but before she could answer, her knees buckled. She crumpled to the ground with a soft thud, her head barely missing the iron armrest. Daniel dropped his backpack and sprinted forward. "Ma'am, stay with me." Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow, her pulse faint. Panic flickered across her features as she tried to focus on him, but her eyes rolled back, and she went still. "No, no, no," Daniel muttered, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. There it was. Weak, but there. He tilted her head back, checking her airway, then began chest compressions when her breathing faltered. His hands moved with steady precision, his training guiding him even as adrenaline surged through his veins. "Come on," he whispered under his breath. "Stay with me." He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed for an ambulance while continuing compressions. "Yes, Riverside Park near the north entrance," he barked into the phone. "Female, unconscious, weak pulse, possible cardiac arrest. I'm initiating CPR." By the time the wail of sirens pierced the quiet park, Daniel was drenched in sweat, his muscles aching from the effort. The EMTs rushed over, sliding her onto a stretcher. Daniel climbed into the ambulance without hesitation. "I'll ride with her," he said firmly, ignoring the brief look of surprise from one of the paramedics. "I'm a nurse, I won't get in the way." They didn't argue. The ride was a blur of beeping monitors and the sharp smell of antiseptic from the paramedics' kits. Daniel held the woman's hand, murmuring reassurance even though she couldn't hear him. She was striking, her skin a warm brown tone, her hair styled neatly though now slightly disheveled, her features graceful despite the strain of pain. At the hospital, the emergency team swept her into action. Doctors crowded her bedside, barking orders, but Daniel refused to step back. He was the one who had started the fight for her life, and he wasn't about to quit now. Blood pressure dropping, a nurse shouted, "Get the epinephrine ready." "She's not responding." "She will," Daniel said sharply, pushing past hesitation to continue compressions when one of the younger interns faltered. His voice was low but firm, a quiet authority born from years of working in crisis. "She will respond." And she did. A weak but steady beep filled the room as her heart rate climbed. The team exhaled in relief. Daniel finally stepped back, sweat dripping down his forehead, chest heaving with exertion. The woman was alive. Hours later, after she had been stabilized and transferred to a private room, Daniel lingered outside, his exhaustion forgotten. Something about her collapse had struck a chord deeper than any other patient he had helped. He couldn't explain why, only that leaving felt impossible. When at last the attending physician assured him she was awake and asking for the man who had saved her, Daniel stepped into the room. Her eyes met his immediately, wide, alert, filled with gratitude, and then strangely, something else. Shock. "You," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It was you." Daniel smiled faintly. You gave me a scare back there. How are you feeling? I'm fine now. Thanks to you. Her gaze lingered on his face, and then her breath caught. Her hand trembled as she lifted it, almost as if to reach for his cheek. That mark. Daniel stiffened. He had forgotten about the faint birthmark that sat just beneath his left eye, shaped like a teardrop smudge. It had been there his whole life, so ordinary to him he rarely thought of it. What about it? He asked carefully. She dropped her hand and quickly masked her expression. Nothing. Just... It looks familiar. Daniel frowned. I've had it since birth. My adoptive mother said it made me unique. The woman's eyes darkened, memories crashing over her. Her name was Abigail Donovan, and in that moment, she felt as though the earth had split beneath her. Memories pulled her back in time nearly 20 years earlier. She had been young then, a black woman daring to love a man society said she could not have. Richard Donovan, a white billionaire whose empire spanned continents. Their union had made headlines, drawing both admiration and scorn. But for them, love was stronger than whispers. Together they had children, twins, a boy and a girl. Perfect, bright, beautiful children who both bore the same small birthmark on their left cheeks. She remembered kissing those marks every night as they slept, a silly ritual she never tired of. Her happiness, however, had been short-lived. One night, after attending a charity gala with Richard, they had been ambushed on the road. The night air filled with the sound of screeching tires, shouts, and the crack of breaking glass. Richard had fought back, trying to shield them, but Abigail had been struck hard across the temple. When she awoke, her daughter Sophia was wailing in her arms, but her son was gone. Her precious boy had vanished into the night, leaving behind only silence and grief. Abigail had searched. For years, she had searched. But the world had swallowed him whole, leaving her with nothing but nightmares and a gaping wound in her heart. And now, staring at the young man who had saved her life, she saw the same mark, the same eyes, the same age. Could it be? Abigail forced herself to stay composed. She could not speak her suspicions yet, not until she was sure. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Hayes. Daniel." She repeated it like a prayer. "Do you know much about your family?" He hesitated. "Not really. I was adopted when I was about 2. My mom, my adoptive mom, she never told me much about where I came from, just that I was left with her. I don't even know who my birth parents are." Her heart pounded. 2 years old, adopted, a birthmark on his cheek. The timeline, the details, they all fit. Abigail smiled faintly, hiding the tremor in her lips. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the past finds us when we least expect it." Daniel tilted his head, puzzled by her strange tone. But before he could question her further, the door opened, and a nurse entered to check Abigail's vitals. The moment was broken, leaving him with only confusion. As he walked out of the room, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted in his life forever. Abigail, left alone in her bed, clutched the thin blanket with trembling fingers. For the first time in nearly 20 years, hope flickered in her chest. She had found him, or at least she thought she had. Her lost son. The quiet hum of machines filled Abigail's private hospital room, but her mind was anything but quiet. Since regaining consciousness, her thoughts had been consumed with the nurse who saved her. Daniel Hayes, a stranger, yet not a stranger at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that small mark on his left cheek, the same mark her twins had shared. For nearly 20 years, she had lived with the weight of loss. Her son had been stolen, ripped away from her arms in the chaos of that night. No matter how many investigators Richard hired, no matter how many leads she chased, the boy had vanished without a trace, and now, by some twist of fate, he had saved her life. Abigail's hands trembled as she reached for the notepad on her bedside table. She scribbled his name, circling it over and over. Daniel Hayes, adopted at 2 years old. The same timeline, the same birthmark, the right age. Her heart ached with a hope she had buried long ago. But hope, she reminded herself, could be dangerous. She needed proof. Daniel, meanwhile, was restless. He had been granted the rest of the day off, but his mind refused to settle. He had always been good at compartmentalizing. Work was work, life was life. But something about Abigail Donovan unsettled him. The way she had looked at him, the way her voice trembled when she asked about his past. It was as if she saw through him, into the questions he had tried to ignore his whole life. That night, sitting alone in his small apartment, he dug through the few papers his adoptive mother had kept about his adoption. A single certificate, a date. No names of birth parents, just a vague line. Biological parents unknown. He stared at the date. June 2004. The year he turned 2. He rubbed his thumb over the mark on his cheek, staring at his reflection in the mirror. For the first time, the mark didn't feel like a random quirk of nature. It felt like a clue. Abigail couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She needed answers. The next day, after being discharged, she began making quiet inquiries. Years of moving in Richard's circles had taught her how to hire people discreetly. She didn't want to raise her husband's hopes until she was sure. Within days, she had Daniel's adoption file in her hands. The papers were thin, too thin. A child left with no biological information, adopted quickly, with gaps that looked more like cover-ups than coincidences. Her heart pounded as she scanned the dates. The very month her son was kidnapped, Daniel had appeared in the adoption system. Her throat tightened. Could it truly be this simple? Sophia Donovan stormed into Abigail's sitting room later that week, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She had inherited her father's striking blue eyes and her mother's stubborn will. "Mother," she said, folding her arms, "why have you been acting so secretive? I heard from one of the staff that you've been asking questions about some nurse." Abigail looked up from the file she was reading. She hesitated, then decided her daughter deserved the truth. "Sophia, I believe I may have found your brother." Sophia froze, disbelief etched on her face. "My... what? Mother, no. You can't do this to yourself again. I'm serious, Sophia. The nurse who saved me, his name is Daniel Hayes. He has the same mark, Sophia. The same mark you both had." "That's not proof," Sophia said quickly, her voice tight. "You've chased shadows for years, and every time you get hurt. This man is just a coincidence." But Abigail's eyes burned with conviction. Coincidence doesn't explain the adoption records. He was adopted the same year, at the same age. Everything fits. Sophia shook her head, torn between fear and hope. She had grown up in the shadow of her mother's grief, always feeling like half of her family was missing. But the idea that he might actually be alive, it was too much. Too dangerous. "Mother," she whispered. "Softer now. What if you're wrong again? What if this destroys you?" Abigail closed the file and placed a hand over her daughter's. "And what if I'm right?" Richard Donovan sat in his study, surrounded by the dark oak shelves and the faint smell of old leather. He listened in silence as Abigail laid everything before him. The collapse in the park, the nurse who saved her, the birthmark, the adoption records. For a long time he said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant. "Richard," Abigail whispered. "Say something." Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled beneath his chin. "You've always believed he was out there. I wanted to believe it too, but after so many years..." His voice faltered. "I buried that hope because it hurt too much." Abigail reached for his hand. "Look at the facts. The adoption, the timing, the mark. Richard, it can't be chance." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her conviction, her trembling hope. Slowly, he nodded. "If there's even a chance, I'll find the truth. Quietly. If he is our son, I won't lose him again." Richard's resources were vast. And when he set his investigators on Daniel Hayes's adoption, the truth began to unravel. A report landed on his desk 3 weeks later, its pages filled with names, dates, and testimonies. Daniel's adoptive mother had indeed received him from a man late at night with no official record of the handoff. That man, as the investigators uncovered, had ties to one of Richard's fiercest business rivals, Gerald Whitman, a former partner turned enemy. Whitman had every motive to strike at Richard. Not only had he lost millions in a failed deal, but he had publicly criticized Richard's interracial marriage, calling it a stain on the Donovan name. The night of the ambush suddenly looked less like a random attack and more like a calculated strike. Richard's blood boiled as he read the details. His son hadn't been lost to chance. He had been stolen. Meanwhile, Daniel's confusion deepened with every passing day. Abigail had begun visiting the hospital more often, always asking for him. Her questions grew personal. About his childhood, his earliest memories, even his mark. At first, he brushed it off as gratitude, but soon it became clear she was searching for something. One afternoon, she finally said it. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think you may be my son." He froze. "What?" She swallowed hard. 19 years ago, my son was kidnapped. He was 2 years old. He had the same mark you have, and the same year. You were adopted. Daniel, I believe you are him." The words hung in the air like thunder. Daniel shook his head. No, that can't be. My mom, she raised me. She loved me. She didn't steal me." "I'm not saying she did," Abigail said quickly, "but someone gave you to her. Someone who took you from me." Daniel's chest tightened, his breath uneven. He thought of his adoptive mother, the way she had always dodged questions, the way she looked at him sometimes with an almost guilty love. Could it be true? "I can't just believe this," he said hoarsely. "I need proof." Abigail reached across the table, her eyes wet with tears. "Then let's get proof. A DNA test. If I'm wrong, I'll never trouble you again. But if I'm right—" She broke off, her voice cracking. "If I'm right, then I've found the son I've prayed for every day since that night." Daniel stared at her, his heart torn in two. His entire life had been built on unanswered questions, but he had never imagined the answers could lead here. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "All right," he whispered. "We'll do the test." Abigail left that day with tears streaming down her face, both from fear and from hope. For nearly 20 years, she had lived with a wound that never healed. Now, for the first time, she dared to believe that healing might be possible. And Daniel. He returned home to his apartment, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The mark on his cheek seemed to burn beneath his skin, no longer a random smudge but a symbol of a life stolen, a truth buried. For the first time in his life, Daniel Hayes wasn't sure who he really was. The DNA results arrived faster than Abigail expected. She had paced the Donovan estate for days, her nerves fraying with every passing hour. Each tick of the clock felt like a drumbeat pounding against her ribs. Finally, the envelope came. Thick, official, heavy with truth. Richard stood by her side in his study as she slid it open, her hands trembling. Sophia hovered near the fireplace, her arms crossed tightly, eyes darting between her parents with a mix of fear and anticipation. Abigail unfolded the paper. Her breath caught. 99.9% probability. Tears blurred her vision. Her knees buckled, and Richard caught her, pulling her against his chest. "It's him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's our son." Richard closed his eyes, his jaw tightening with both relief and rage. "Then it's true," he murmured. "Gerald Whitman took him. He stole our boy." Sophia's lips parted in shock. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears brimming. For years she had tried to silence her mother's hope, to protect her from disappointment. But now, standing in the glow of undeniable truth, she felt her heart swell with a strange mixture of joy and fear. Her brother was alive. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. The call from Abigail had been brief, almost hesitant, but her words had changed everything. The test? It's positive. Daniel, you are my son. He hadn't known what to say. The silence on his end stretched too long, and finally she whispered, I understand you need time, before ending the call. Now, alone in his apartment, Daniel felt like his entire life had cracked open. The woman who had raised him, his mother, had died years ago. She had been kind, warm, but always guarded when it came to his adoption. He had accepted her silence, believing some things were better left alone. But now, every unanswered question screamed inside him. Who was he really? Daniel Hayes? Or Daniel Donovan? Richard wasted no time. Within days, his investigators dug deeper, tracing every thread of Daniel's stolen past. What they uncovered chilled him. Whitman had orchestrated the ambush 19 years ago, paying off desperate men to attack Abigail. In the chaos, the boy had been snatched and funneled through a corrupt adoption network. It was a crime disguised as coincidence, a wound that had shaped their family for 2 decades. Richard's fury simmered. He had always been ruthless in business, but this was personal. Whitman had not only betrayed him as a partner, he had torn apart his family. He looked at Abigail across the table that night, her face pale but determined. We can't just welcome Daniel back and pretend none of this happened, he said. Whitman needs to pay. Abigail reached for his hand. Yes. But first, we need to bring Daniel home. Sophia was the first to try. She arranged to meet Daniel at a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of reporters. He arrived looking wary, his posture tense. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Sophia broke the silence. You look like him, she said softly. Father, you have his eyes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I don't even know who I am right now. Sophia leaned forward, her voice earnest. I know this is overwhelming, but you're my brother. I've felt your absence my whole life, even when I didn't understand it. And now, you're here. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to believe her, to let the warmth in her voice ease the storm inside him. But he thought of his late adoptive mother, of her laughter, her sacrifices. Was it betrayal to embrace this new family? Sophia reached across the table and placed her hand over his. You don't have to decide everything now, just don't walk away. Please. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to meet her gaze, and in her eyes, he saw something that unsettled him more than anything: recognition. Abigail's reunion with Daniel was both fragile and fierce. When she finally saw him again after the results, she couldn't help herself. She reached out, cupping his face in her hands, as tears spilled down her cheeks. My baby, she whispered. They stole you from me, but God, He brought you back. Daniel stood frozen at first, the weight of her words pressing down on him. But slowly, he let her embrace him. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't even realized he was missing: belonging. Richard, however, was not a man of sentiment. His love for his son was fierce, but it burned alongside his thirst for vengeance. He met privately with his security chief, laying out the evidence against Whitman. He took my son, Richard said, his voice low, dangerous. I don't want a lawsuit, I don't want negotiations, I want him broken. The chief nodded. Understood, but Abigail overheard. That night in their bedroom, she confronted him. Richard, no. You can't let revenge consume you. We've already lost 19 years. I won't lose Daniel to violence. Richard turned to her, his eyes cold. You don't understand. Whitman doesn't stop unless he's crushed. If I don't end this, he'll come for us again. Abigail gripped his arm. Then end it with truth. Expose him. Destroy him legally, publicly, but don't stain Daniel's return with blood. For a moment, Richard's hardened mask cracked. He saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation. With a heavy sigh, he pulled her close. For you. For him. I'll do it your way. But Whitman was not a man easily cornered. When whispers of Richard's investigation reached him, he struck first. A scandal erupted in the press, fueled by leaked documents suggesting Daniel Hayes had falsified medical certifications to secure his nursing position. Overnight, Daniel's reputation crumbled. He was suspended pending investigation, his career hanging by a thread. The Donovans recognized Whitman's hand immediately. Abigail rushed to Daniel's side, finding him in his apartment, surrounded by unopened letters and silence. "This is him," she said firmly. "Whitman. He's trying to discredit you before the truth comes out." Daniel's eyes were hollow. "My whole life feels like a lie. Now my career too? Maybe I don't belong anywhere." Abigail dropped to her knees before him, gripping his hands. "Don't you dare believe that. You are my son, you belong here. And I will fight with everything I have to clear your name." For the first time, Daniel saw not just a grieving mother, but a warrior. And something inside him began to shift. The final confrontation came weeks later. Richard's team uncovered irrefutable evidence linking Whitman to the kidnapping, financial records, eyewitness testimony, even the corrupt adoption papers. Richard stood before the press with Abigail, Sophia, and Daniel by his side. Cameras flashed as he laid out the truth. 19 years ago, my son was stolen, Richard declared, his voice steady but fierce. Today, we reclaim not only him, but justice. Gerald Whitman orchestrated a crime against my family, against a child, and he will answer for it. Abigail's hand clutched Daniel's as the room buzzed with shock and outrage. Whitman was arrested within hours, his empire collapsing under the weight of scandal. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Donovan family stood whole, bruised but unbroken. That night, in the quiet of the estate, Abigail sat with Daniel in the garden. The stars stretched endlessly above them. "I don't expect you to just slip into this life," she said softly. "But I hope you'll let us be your family." Daniel looked at her, his heart still torn, but healing. "I don't know how to be anyone but me, but maybe I don't have to choose. Maybe I can be both." Abigail smiled through tears, squeezing his hand. "You're my son. That's all I'll ever need." For the first time in 19 years, the Donovan family felt complete. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole. And as the night wrapped around them, Daniel realized that the question of who he was didn't need a single answer. He was Daniel Hayes. He was Daniel Donovan. He was both. And he was home. The long dining hall of the Donovan mansion had never felt so alive. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in soft golden light, reflecting off polished mahogany and the gleam of fine china. For years, meals here had been marked by silence, formality, or the clink of silverware against porcelain. Tonight it rang with something far rarer: laughter. Abigail sat at the head of the table, her posture regal yet relaxed in a way no one had seen in years. She kept glancing at Daniel, as if reassuring herself he was truly there and not a dream that might vanish when she blinked. Her hand often drifted across the table to touch his, as though to anchor him in her reality. Richard, usually stoic, allowed himself moments of quiet joy. He poured wine, cracked a joke that earned a real laugh from Sophia, and when his eyes landed on Daniel, there was pride mixed with the fierce protectiveness of a father who had nearly lost everything. Sophia had taken her seat beside Daniel. She leaned into him like a sister who had finally found her missing half. At one point, she teased him about his choice of tie, and the room erupted in laughter, Daniel included. For Daniel, it was overwhelming. The mansion, the wealth, the grandeur, it all felt alien. Yet the warmth that wrapped around him tonight was familiar in a way he hadn't expected. It was the belonging he had spent his life searching for, found not in papers or scars, but in the faces gathered around him. Dinner stretched long into the night. Stories were told. Old wounds were acknowledged, and new memories were planted like seeds for a future they all intended to grow together. At the end, Abigail raised her glass, her eyes shimmering. "To family," she said softly, her voice catching. Richard, Sophia, and Daniel lifted theirs in unison. "To family." And for the first time in many years, the Donovan family was whole again. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together.